Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Mike Weaver. I'm the Director of Enterprise Migrations and Product Owner here at Quadratec. I joined Quadratec from industry where I specialized in mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. I'm joined here today with Paul Robenshaw. Paul is our Chief Technology Officer here at Quadratec. Paul is a 15-time Microsoft Office Systems and Server MVP, and at Quadratec he's responsible for product evangelism and communications. Hi, Paul and I are coming to you live today from our offices in Žilina, Slovakia. We are out with our teams designing the next big things here at Quadratec. Paul and I are both work with our teams mainly remotely, so we always enjoy when we get this in-person planning time. And it worked out today where we could actually sit in the same room and talk to each other.
It did, but boy, is it cold here in Slovakia. I'm not a big fan of that.
I know. The walk into the office this morning was pretty raw on the face. This is a second session in our series on mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. If you missed the first session, you can access it from our website. And hopefully shortly we'll also have the announcement for the final version of our three-part series. Before we get started, I would like to review a few pieces of housekeeping. At this time, all lines are currently muted and will remain muted for the session today. Although if you have any questions, feel free to send them to us using the questions features in the right toolbar. We'll attempt to answer them all during the session or at the end of the session. The session is also being recorded, so if any of your friends missed it and they want to see it, they can hop on and view it at a later date. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to review today's agenda.
Cool, thanks Mike, and welcome everybody. So for our agenda today, there are a few specific things that we want to talk about around the topic of divestitures. So in part one of this series, we talked about the logistics behind mergers and acquisitions in Office 365. How you decide where your data goes, how you decide who should decide, and so on. So today we're going to visit that same topic from a different angle, that of one where the environment dictates, if you will, that you're going to divest some part of your business assets, either by spinning off those assets into a completely separate entity or by selling those assets to somebody else. So whereas in part one, we talked about buying those assets and bringing them under the umbrella of your own organization, now we're going to talk about the reverse case. So we'll talk about the dynamics behind those divestitures. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some of the business problems that are inherent in those types of divestiture operations. And then Mike is going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how you actually make those divestitures happen with a minimum of hassle for people. Now, as Mike mentioned earlier, we have part three coming up where we're going to talk specifically about data sovereignty, the issue of where your data lives and who has access to it and what you have to do to be legally compliant. So we won't be announcing the date in this webcast, but keep an eye on Twitter and on the Quadratec blog, and you'll see an announcement of when part three will be. So before we dive into talking about divestitures, I wanted to give Mike a chance to talk about some recent divestiture action in the news.
And I think that divestitures is an interesting topic because a lot of people, even when we talk about M&A and mergers and acquisitions, they ignore this aspect of it. But it's a really critical problem, and a lot of times it's tied with a merger. So in a lot of cases, specifically in the United States, when a company buys a competing company, they have to divest some assets to even close, and there's this fire sale of trying to get a segment of their business either spun off into a separate entity or off to another competitor, which is an entire problem together. So ensuring this problem of that, getting the correct people and the correct data and everything moved over correctly is extremely important. And these are just three headlines that we picked off the news the other day, where this isn't just small companies that have this problem. They're these very large enterprises. And those of you listening today, maybe joining as one of these organizations or dealing with this problem. So it's a very unique challenge. The merger aspect is a whole challenge that a lot of us deal with in industry. But the side effect of divestiture is an entirely different problem. But the mechanics from a technology perspective is still familiar, which is the I guess, comforting part of it, but still how to do it becomes a problem.
So if you look at the dynamics behind divestitures, there are a couple of very common patterns that you see over and over. One is that a divestiture may be required as part of an M&A. So company A buys company B, and some regulatory authority in the US, in the EU, or someplace else says, okay, great, this merger can proceed, but you have to lose some part of the combined company's assets to preserve competition. Frankly, in the US, we don't see nearly as much of this as a driver of divestitures as we used to 15 or 20 years ago, but it's still pretty prevalent in the EU. This is entirely tied to how active antitrust regulators are in a given jurisdiction. Another reason is that you see companies deciding that, okay, part of my business is not performing the way that I want it to, so I'm going to sell it off. Or alternatively, I think there's some value in a particular business segment and I want to sell it off to let it stand alone. If you look at my example section, when Air Canada sold off their frequent flyer program some years ago, the whole reason that they did that, the reason that they divested it, was because they thought it would be worth more as a standalone business than it would be worth under the Air Canada umbrella. And it turns out that at least for the first few years, they were right. The Time Warner merger is an example of the first category of divestiture requirements. When Time Warner wanted to buy wanted to buy Turner Communications, the US Justice Department required them to spin off America Online, which is still around, by the way, in case you were wondering. Netgear is divesting their Arlo camera line because they believe they will make more money by having that as an independent business unit that Netgear retains some ownership of than otherwise. The Amazon note is interesting because this is a good example of the kind of discussion that you see surrounding these types of activities. About 2 years ago, an investment group said, you know, it'd be a great idea. Amazon would make more money if they spun off AWS. And so rumors started to float around that they would do it or they wouldn't do it or whatever. At the AWS reInvent conference in December of 2017, their CEO was asked about this. He said, well, from a business standpoint, it doesn't make sense for us to do this because AWS is certainly not underperforming. Amazon as a parent doesn't really gain anything by spinning that business unit off because they don't really want to sell it, and they're not being required to do that as part of another M&A activity. Okay, Mike, next slide, please. So it's helpful to define some vocabulary, and we're trying to use this vocabulary in a standardized way across all of the webcasts that Mike and I are doing. The first case is, let's say that company A has some assets, whether that asset is an entire business unit or a portion of a business unit or even a single product, and they want to turn that into a separate entity because regulators are making them, because they think it will be more profitable, whatever the reason. We'll call that a spinoff. So some of the assets from A are being spun off into a completely separate entity. Now the flip side of that, let's say that company A is selling some assets to company B. This is the opposite side of the coin from the merger and acquisition scenarios that we covered in part 1 of the webcast. So in that case, we can consider this to be an acquisition by company B of some assets that belong to company A. I didn't love any of the terms that we batted around for trying to figure out how to talk about this, but one relatively convenient way that's not too awful is to say that the existing business is the parent and the unit that's being spun off or transferred is the child. The reason why this nomenclature sort of works is that you can have a parent that has multiple children. The children can go to different places. One may go to college, one may go to trade school, one may join the Marine Corps. And when you think about the dynamics of a typical parent and child relationship, the child starts off as being completely dependent on and integrated with the parent, and then over time, as the child grows, it becomes more independent, and eventually leaves home. Not a great analogy, but also reasonably close to what we're talking about.
I think what's interesting here, it's also the context, what side of the sale you're on. So,
right.
And that's the context too. So if you're the company divesting, you know, you more consider it a divestiture because you have all these challenges we're going to talk about here. Whereas if you're the one acquiring, it's good to know what that firm's going through, because sometimes we're just used to focusing on the data and don't understand the nuts and bolts behind what the organization's doing. So it's interesting to see both. But from the company purchasing, it's more of an acquisition scenario in their mind.
And that's a really good point. Throughout these webinars, we're talking about the nuts and bolts of how you do these things and what the business impacts are. But you always have to remember, in the larger context, these are big upheavals for the people whose jobs or positions or technologies are being moved from one place to another.
Yep.
Right. And we're not trying, I don't mean to minimize that in any way, but we're not talking about it just because we're not HR professionals. Right, we're here to help you understand.
We have some documents we're writing, and the emotional side of M&A is something we're going to be doing some work on, because it's just It's an interesting thing where you can't just look at the non-human element because it's part of your IT experience. When that user comes in Monday morning, they may have a new boss, a new job, and when their physical technology or their technology isn't working, it's an immediate call to help desk because they're having a really bad day, even more than the emotions that they're already dealing with. And you can see the statistics behind it. So that's where there's even more pressure for us as technologists to perform in the space, is we've got to get one thing off of that person's plate. At least I can boot up and get into my email and get to my stuff.
Of everything I have to worry about, the last thing I want to have to worry about is whether I even can do my job at this new place with a new boss in a new environment that I don't understand and maybe I'm afraid of. By God, at least I better be able to log into Exchange.
Yeah, Friday night my phone was wiped because somebody screwed up the merge or something like that.
Okay, next slide. So continuing vocabulary, a divestiture is when you take some assets from one business and you put them someplace else, right? It can be through a sale, a stock swap. Some of you may remember when Apple and Next, quote unquote, merged. That was really kind of a reverse acquisition in that the Next team, including Steve Jobs, ended up running the much bigger, better financed Apple. But those kinds of reverse mergers are not uncommon. So technically that would be an acquisition of a divestiture. But practically, that's not really what happened. The acquisition, you can think of for every divestiture, there will be an acquisition on the opposite side. Maybe not every, because in a spin-off situation where you're taking a portion of a company's assets and turning them into a new legal entity, there isn't a purchase per se on the opposite side to balance that. So you'll see both of these happen with some frequency. Then we don't really have a good vocabulary for this, but internally we use the term leavers to refer to people who are leaving an organization. In an M&A or divestiture scenario, the leavers are the people who are leaving one organization and going someplace else. It also might refer to people who are leaving a company where you have to put their mailbox on hold for preservation reasons. So the term kind of fits here. And remainers or stayers, those are the people who stay behind or are not moved as part of the divestiture. So in the example of Netgear divesting their camera unit, for example, the leavers are going to be all the people from administrative assistants to janitors to engineers to chief whatevers who are migrating out of the Netgear organization to this new camera focused organization. The remainers or the stayers are all the people who stay around after that. So with that vocabulary established, let's start talking about some of the problems from a business standpoint that people face with divestiture scenarios. The first one is the desert island problem. You've all heard variations of this question. Okay, you're on a desert island for the rest of your life, like Tom Hanks in Castaway. What do you take with you? What books do you take? What records do you take? What foods do you want, etc.? So if you're going to a desert island, what would you take with you? When the child or the leavers leave in a divestiture scenario, what data and services do they need to take with them to be able to continue to function? So think for 1 second about the case where you have an organization that's honed in Office 365. They've got Azure Active Directory, they have Exchange Online, they have OneDrive, they have other services. And you're now going to cut that organization into pieces, and one piece is going to go someplace else. Well, how do you do that from an Active Directory perspective? How do you do that from a OneDrive perspective? If you have people who have shared files with other users, which of course they will have, how do you decide which files are okay to move and which ones need to stay behind in the merged organization? Sort of the more interesting meta question is, how do you decide who gets to decide that? Is it somebody at the parent? Is it somebody at the child? Ideally, the people who are leaving should be best equipped to know what they'll need to keep doing their jobs after they leave, but maybe there are business or organizational reasons why you don't want to let those people decide what they take with them. In the same way that when my son went off to college, I was not about to let him raid my dresser and take whatever shirts he thought he wanted, because he would have taken all my good concert shirts. So as a parent, you have to kind of be in tune with what your children are proposing to take away. Now the next case is related to that. I call it the mattress problem. There's a pretty good argument that the prevalence of mattress stores in a given geographical area, at least in North America, is a good proxy for the divorce rate. Because what happens almost 100% of the time is when a couple breaks up, somebody's moving out and they're going to need a new mattress. So there's this whole fascinating topic around how you decide who's keeping the existing mattress and who gets to buy a new one. But our parallel for divestiture is, okay, in the case of a spinoff, how is the spinoff interacting with the parent? Is it being separately funded? Is it going to take charge of its own divestiture, or is the parent doing all the labor? In the case of a more traditional divestiture that's paired with an acquisition, is the company that is buying those assets, are they responsible for the migration? Are they responsible for funding and executing that operation? Or is the seller responsible? This is exactly identical to a real estate transaction in that everything is negotiable, right? When two parties are involved in a merger and divestiture scenario, they can decide who's going to pay and who's going to be responsible. There is no right or wrong answer, but understanding and knowing who's responsible is really important, whichever side of that transaction you sit on.
It's also how fast the landlord might want you out of the house.
Good
so,
point.
you know, a lot of these in
Good
these
point.
regulations, these divestitures have to happen. So sometimes where it's spin off in your own organization, you're happy with a 6-month TSA, transitional service agreement. But if it's holding up your close of your sale, you know, 30 days or 2 weeks notice is you know, really aggressive. But that may be what the organization wants, is to get those assets divested as soon as possible.
We touched on this in part one too,
Yeah.
if you remember, that a lot of times the business people are dictating the schedule and they don't consult the IT team at all. They come to the IT team and say, in 30 days,
Get them out.
all jump packed and these people need to be in a new organization.
Yep.
That always makes it more fun.
Absolutely.
Okay, next slide. So some of these problems will look familiar to the people who attended part one, and that's because they are the same problem, just with a little bit different focus. So if you think about what has to happen during a divestiture, whether it's a spinoff or an acquisition scenario, you still have all the issues around Microsoft licensing that you have to deal with. How many licenses do I have? How many should I have? And how do I reconcile those two? The big problem here for a divestiture scenario is that Microsoft doesn't give you a way to transfer licenses between tenants. So let's say that you have 10,000 users and you're spinning 2,000 of them off into a brand new business operation. As far as Microsoft is concerned, you now have to buy 2,000 licenses for that new tenant, because there is no way for you to move those licenses from one tenant to another. That means that all of a sudden, in your tenant where you have 10,000 licenses, you only need 8,000, and you can't get a refund. And in the new tenant, you need 2,000 that you have to buy from scratch. So sucks to be you, because Microsoft doesn't give you tools to effectively manage that. But understanding the magnitude of what licenses have to go where is a really important part of understanding this overall process. The next big thing you have to worry about is permissions and security access. We preach all the time, in part because we sell products that help do this, that you really have to have a good understanding of which users have access to what resources, both on-prem and in the cloud, before you move the first user. Because at some point in a divestiture scenario, you're going to have to make the decision about when you cut people off. And where that point falls is dictated by the schedule that Mike mentioned earlier, where you may only have 30 days or 60 days to completely execute this very complicated ballet of moving people from point to point. You also have to be prepared for the case, and this is familiar to any parent who's ever sent a child off to college, of, oops, I forgot something. There's this critical piece of data that I need, or this critical resource that I need to continue business operations, and I didn't take it with me, and now I need it. So the college student equivalent is, Dad, I forgot my laptop, I need you to FedEx it to me. The divestiture equivalent is, there's some amount of data, whether it's in a SQL Server database, a OneDrive repository, a SharePoint online document library, wherever it is, oops, there's this thing I need, and I should have taken it with me, but I didn't know I needed it until just now, and now I need it urgently. How are you going to get it to me? And then finally, this is an ongoing thread that runs through pretty much everything that we do as a migration services company. Where is your data going to live when you're done? If you're talking about taking a US only business and divesting US only assets into a new US only subsidiary or standalone company as a traditional spinoff, that's not too bad. The ugliness comes if you're, for example, taking a business unit that operates in the EU and is subject to EU privacy regulation, and now you want to move all of its data into the US, just to cite one example. Generally, it's easiest to move from one level of privacy to another. And as soon as you go from an unregulated area like the US or maybe Canada into a more regulated area, the EU being the best example, things get a lot more difficult. So I scratched out business at the top of this slide on purpose because we're segueing from talking about business problems to talking about technology problems. The first, and this is something that's true for almost everything that you might do with Office 365, the first thing to keep in mind is that you're going to have some kind of coexistence. So until the last lever has left, you have to have some way to get mail between the parent organization and the child organization. You have to have a way to move files. You have to have a way to see permissions and see sharing data. Once all of the levers have gone wherever it is they're going, then maybe you can turn that off, but then again, maybe not. Because sometimes when you have a spinoff or a divestiture scenario, you also end up with a joint operating agreement of some kind that says, we're going to spin this unit off, but we're going to stay in business together for a year, 2 years, or however long. Now, speaking of spinoffs, this is a tricky question. When the spinoff goes into its new tenant, its new environment, are you giving them a clone where everything is the same as it was before, or do they get to choose their own things like mobile device management policies? Which of those approaches you take is going to have a huge influence on which tools you use to do the move, because if you're just going to say, okay, spin off, I'm going to open a new blank tenant for you and move your data, and then you can do whatever the hell you want to after that point. That's very different than saying, okay, spin off, I'm going to put you in an environment where everything is as close as possible to the environment that you're leaving. Not to wear out the parent or child going to college environment, but on one hand, hey child, you're in a dorm room, you furnish it the way you want it, everything has to be new, versus I want it to be a familiar environment, so I'm going to let you take some wall hangings and some decorations from home. Then finally, from a technology standpoint, how do you unify on the acquisition side of a divestiture? The short answer is it's just like a traditional M&A, right? The difference is that a company is buying business assets from another company and integrating them in. Really, we would consider that on the M&A side to be an acquisition. The difference is the people who are on this webcast are probably here because they're thinking about getting rid of something. The people who attended the first webcast were thinking in terms of bringing something into their organization. So from your perspective, as someone who may be managing a spinoff or a bunch of levers, the acquisition side is something that the acquirer is going to have to spend a lot of time worrying about. You can go back and listen to the recordings of part 1 to get a sense where Mike and I stand on that set of problems, but it's not trivial.
Absolutely. So I think now we're going to transition into the how do we do this. So right. A lot of times, in webinars, you talk more on theory and don't go into how to do it. So I'm going to share with you some of the industry experience that I have, and Paul's going to share with us too, on how we actually do this. And the example we're going to talk about here is, dealing with highly regulated entities or situations where you may be divesting to a potential competitor, and so where you may have really deep situations. So the technology problems here are similar to what, Paul, you mentioned in your latest slide here. These are the common things that we deal with, from identity management to the system integration, what you're using. But they all kind of follow a similar pattern here, and this is kind of the steps that I used to use in industry. So we need to do analyze, segment, comply, export, import, destruct. And we're going to kind of go over how we deal with each of these. So the first stage, which is the most important stage of everything, is analyzing what do you have. And we are a company that has our radar reporting tool, so I love it for mergers and acquisitions because we can very easily light up and get information. And divestitures, we still use that information. So identifying what employees are going or moving. So that's either comes from your human resources team. In some cases, you may actually have to do a discovery for that business unit across your organization to find who's been working on projects. Gone are the days of the formal line management where this person has everyone working on the same teams. I've been part of projects where we had to do discovery to identify potential employees who may not have been part of the HR lines. So I think what's an interesting aspect is using the e-discovery tools to actually identify this and help the business. And we're going to talk about leveraging e-discovery tools a couple times in here to help with the compliant other portions. Interviews, one of the best things you can do, and they're time consuming but really worth it, is interviewing IT champions or team leads in these organizations. And if you notice there, I don't say managers. Talking to the leads in these areas and sitting down and watching them work. I've sat in call centers before with this and say, gee, can I sit with you while you work and take some calls for an hour? And sitting there and noting with the user what they're doing and the systems that they're using. Agreements. This is something that us in IT usually aren't part of, but ensuring that we're a part of it. Paul mentioned sometimes we're just brought in and, hey, execute this. So those are kind of the unfriendly situations. But usually there's some good legal, business, and IT agreement on what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Paul mentioned this. What do you do with the leftovers? What do you do with the laptop or power adapter your kid left at home? What's going to happen after? So having an agreement on how data is going to be handled, on when data is moved behind, not if, because it is going to happen where you're going to find something. Out of scope data. So what do you do when you find something that somebody said they needed but is outside of the scope of the agreement? So is there an agreed process on how that's going to be remediated? So putting these procedures in up front is very important. That's also a violation procedure. What do we do if on migration night we find a user has something that's in violation of our agreement? What is going to happen? Are we going to discount that entire user until we can have an analysis done and figure it out, or are we just going to try to identify the items? It's very important. Export formats. So a lot of these, we do cross-tenant divestitures now, which is, we did this great project where we kind of took on some of the middle ground of we were the demarc point, so to say, where we were given permissions in our application to take the data out and put it in. But some cases you need to actually export the data. So how is it going to be exported? If you're the firm buying that divestiture, you want to ensure you're getting it in a format where you can actually work on it and how you're going to get it. Agreeing on SMTP domains. So who's getting in the split? We talk about mattresses, but who's getting the SMTP domains that are associated with the company? Are you going to allow direction and forwarding? This is usually part of it. How many days are you going to do the forwarding for? What are you going to do when you have issues with forwarding? Are you going to have an engagement process to have an outage call with the two organizations? You're used to working together, and now you've got to have this piece of doing it. Who's going to own the DNS records and MX records going forward? All these things have to be addressed. And then what's very important is destruction of the source. How long am I going to keep that data for? And this gets very important because you, as a person divesting, want to ensure that you don't have this data for too long, because you may be dragged into litigation down the road as having the source of the data. Right. So part of the legal agreements are who's liable legally before, where this data was and which business is going to have to defend in a litigation if on the dates. But this data source is actually very important. So you may find you have to keep it because you're the one who's still responsible for the customer experience before that date, or you're not responsible. So you want that data all to be provided and purged from your environment.
One thing I want to throw in, Mike, there are consulting companies that specialize in this kind of M&A and divestiture activity. And the reason is not just that the mechanics of doing it is hard. It's that there's a ton of stuff that can bite you in the butt that you wouldn't think about if you've never done this before. Mike has given you a pretty good list. Just look under the agreement bullet here. Would you have thought to, hey, would you have thought to put a restriction in or put a clause in to handle what happens if somebody moves something they weren't supposed to? A lot of customers never would have thought of that until they found out the hard way.
Until at 2 in the morning, and you deal with it. I've had this situation where at 2 in the morning, you're sitting at the airport, can I drop the hard drive or not? You know, and no, okay, well then they're not getting their data this weekend. It's a very interesting scenario. The biggest thing from IT, the base thing, is ensure you have a good TSA, a transitional service agreement. If you don't have one, you need to force and get your legal team to create one. It's a very important way to clear the air and come up with an agreement. So that's analyze. Then we move to the segment. So what can users take? Can users just take everything? So are they going to a spinoff? Is it friendly? Are they going to be a competitor of ours? Do I care if they take too much data? Or I have to divest this state so that I can close this acquisition, but they're my direct competitor. I want them to only take this very basic information so that they can service their customers we're divesting, but I don't want them getting a strategy document from 2 years ago, or I don't want them getting system architecture rollout or things like that that are very important. So segment is very important, and unfortunately segment is not that easy in the situations where you're only allowing a very small amount of data, and this is unfortunately the only way that I've found to effectively do it is creating folders. And it really is on the user, and as part of this, you have to ensure the business is giving these users enough time to do these activities, but creating an agreement, and I'm going to use network share data and mailbox data as examples here, is we're going to move the user's calendar, contacts, tasks, and notes, and anything that's in this to Contoso folder. If it's not in the Contoso folder, to Contoso folder, they aren't getting it.
Right.
And I put a pound sign in front of it, so it's the first folder in the, because I like that exchange trick that we always used to use to get focus on the top. And then sometimes we'd say, okay, and the last 2 days that are in the inbox, acknowledging the user may not have been able to do it for the last 48 hours, and that it's close enough where we probably won't have, violation data. Network share, same thing. Or can they only take the last year of data? Or am I going to put a restriction on it anyway? So you put it in there, I'm going to ignore it if it's more than 5 years old. It's out of scope, things like that. It's very important that the segmentation is an agreement with your TSA. And if there's a violation, how you handle this. Which goes to comply. So we used to use our e-discovery tools to look for very critical information. So for example, if I know in that state there was a project that was launched in another state that is very critical intellectual property in it that I don't want to go over, I'm going to do an e-discovery search on those folders and areas to try to find it and find my violations.
Right, you want to try to find everything that you can as quickly as possible.
And what's really nice with the AI and the E5 agreement with the Advanced E-Discovery Pack in your E5 licenses, if you're on Office 365, that technology has gotten really good. So you're able to really treat it like a legal case, right? Do the analysis and treat it like you're exporting it for litigation, right. But instead you're exporting it to the firm to go. So this really helps you identify that information. Following your violation procedure. So what happens when you find violations? Hopefully your e-discovery is going to be run by a legal compliance person assigned to your project, but what's going to happen when you find that? Are you just going to pluck those items out and let the rest go? Or are you going to say where there's smoke, there's fire, and if a user has more than 5 violations, they can't move until somebody can manually sort or something like that. Lock the folders down. So usually if I'm doing a weekend migration on Wednesday, we would lock down these folders so we can do the proper discovery and communicating this to users and ensuring that we got everything going. And that's where from that date forward, we take anything that came in the inbox, telling users, okay, if you leave it in your inbox, we're going to take it over with you. Some companies use the honor system and don't do the searching. And that, again, depends on your regulations. It also depends how good your legal agreement is. So if you're going to have a huge violation, if somebody breaks it, so I say relying on the honor system, you're really relying on your legal agreement that if somebody took competitor data, they can't use it. It really depends on your business situation and how competitive the situation is. My advice is don't overbuild. You don't want to be the IT person that comes in and demands all of this if it just isn't reasonable. You want to enable your users as much as you can while protecting. So you don't want to put all this red tape in that's unnecessary if you don't have this regulation. Export and import, pretty basic.
Yep.
Except not as easy with the data volumes that we're talking about.
Well, easy to understand and easy to do are two different things, right?
I think what's so entertaining is a lot of people think we're beyond the days of shipping hard drives, but we're not. and you know, internet speed is fast, but it's not fast enough to move terabytes of data.
Right.
You know, the meeting, I'm not joking, and meeting the airplane in the middle of the night, and you know, using critical services of, you know, UPS, FedEx, DHL,
Right.
pick your, or you know, is often the funny part with those is somebody would actually fly out because it was cheaper to put someone on an airplane than actually get a cargo bay underneath assigned to the hard drive. But ensuring that you're exporting this, test it. How long is this extract going to take? If you're coming from Office 365, this extract may take longer than you expect. So that's where our product in Cloud Commander has really been helpful, is we can take care of that cloud to cloud migration and do it faster than shipping it down, and then the other firm's got to put it back up. So that's been very helpful for firms. Testing this, 2 weeks before, test your procedures, ship them a hard drive, ask them to provide you a hard drive and send it back to them. Plan for 2 paths. So one method we used to use is somebody would fly out, we gave them a hard drive, and the next stop was a next day Saturday delivery with you know, your favorite carrier, in case that person got delayed and missed their flight or their luggage got lost.
Yeah, or in case Air France lost their luggage, not that I'm bitter.
Yeah, not that you're bitter or anything. And then you want to, and this is always what I struggle with in industry, is when you're the big, you know, the larger firm divesting to a smaller firm, sometimes that firm isn't used to how to do this. And it was always really hard for me as a technologist to sit there and say, you know, you really need to test this. This is important because you're not going to be able to service my friends that are moving to your organization next week. And so sometimes you find yourself mentoring the smaller firm on this is what's going to happen. Here's what you need to consider, and trying to be the helpful person, but also not creating legal liability for yourself either. It's always the hard piece there. But ensuring that they're taking an extract, practicing, ensuring that they can read the formats, ensuring that the decrypt keys are working. And that you can do it effectively. And finally, destruct. Disable the sources, backup and retained the data as agreed in your agreement. And again, and your legal team will also, you know, be on you for this. Destruct as agreed in the agreement and on time. You know, that's up to you if you're going to send the last, hey, we're destroying it as per the agreement, but you need to destruct on time and follow your procedures. This is like anything else anywhere in our IT world. If you have a procedure, you need to follow it. Ensure you're following through and doing it. You don't want that system hanging around until you end up with those Windows 3.1 boxes, you know, that no one knows what they do in the data center, and you know, you move the data center and have the stuff hanging out. But it's you also want to limit your liability and protect yourself. And obviously document your closeout and follow all your proper procedures with your project management team and everyone else. So hopefully that gives you some good thoughts on how to do, you know, the theory behind it and the actual how you do it. And
it's not an easy process, and the problem is for many of the people who have to do it, they're going to do it once.
Absolutely.
Right, and so it can be tricky to get everything right the first time. You
know, Paul and I are always willing to get on the phone and help our clients. You know, it's a topic that helps us because it's a very big problem in industry. So, you know, even if we can't, you know, help you directly with a software solution, you know, we're always willing to talk to potential clients on how to do it and consult, and, you know, we can point you to various resources as well. So with that, I'm going to kind of check our questions here and see if we have any.
That's how good a job you did, Mike. Nobody has any questions.
Yeah, I know. Yep, so that's all we have. If you do have any questions afterwards, feel free to contact us on our website. More than willing to follow up with you after. And as we said, if you've got a project that you need some advice on or you're stressed out about, and we can kind of help guide you through where to look and where to go. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yep, thanks everybody. Goodbye from Slovakia.